Continued hearing for the residents of South Brookline. My name's Jesse Geller, Christopher Hussey, Jonathan Book, Mark Zuroff, and Avi Liss are consecutively to my left. Tonight's hearing, we will first have a summary on working sessions. Then we will have a presentation of modifications from the applicant. We will then ask whatever questions we may have. That will be followed by a discussion by the ZBA. Then we will open up the testimony to the public. What I would ask is that if you do wish to provide testimony tonight, that you limit your testimony to the modifications that are being presented. The applicant, as we've done in the past, will then have an opportunity to comment if they so choose, and then we will continue this hearing until the next hearing date. In terms of timelines, so that you can set your calendars, after tonight's hearing, the next hearing will be on September the 8th, same time, roughly 7 o'clock. Following that will be a hearing on September 15th, again the same time. Yes. September 8th will be a presentation of final peer review. September 15th will be final presentation of stormwater and traffic. And then we have scheduled a third date, October 6th, 7 o'clock again. Topic to be decided. Okay? Again, I would just remind people, if you are offering testimony tonight, please start by giving us your name and your address. Speak loudly and clearly into the microphone at the dais, and tonight's hearing is being recorded for record. Ms. Steinfeld, do you want to speak to the status of working sessions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Allison Steinfeld, Planning Director. Town staff from the Planning and Building Departments and from the Office of Town Council, ZBA member Chris Hussey, peer reviewer Ted Tolukian, as well as our facilitator Edith Netter, met with Chestnut Hill Realty, including its architect, to discuss site and building design. Chestnut Hill Realty will be presenting to you tonight its response to the recommendations and observations raised in the peer review on site and building design. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Schwartz, presentation?
Mark is going to do the presentation, but we're just thinking that maybe we might want to dim the lights a little bit.
Okay.
Good evening, Chairman Geller, board members, the planning staff. I'm Mark Levin, Chestnut Hill Realty. Over the past several months, we've heard many suggestions for refinements to the design of our plan from the planning staff, the ZBA, the design peer reviewer, and the public. We've incorporated many of the suggestions to make what we think is an even better plan. First off, we've shifted the location of the apartment building, which has enabled us to preserve more of the large rock outcropping at the east end of the building, along with the mature trees located there. We've also refined the design and exterior of the apartment building. We've modified the exterior of the infill buildings. We've also revised the floor plans of the infill buildings to address egress concerns. Lastly, we've reduced parking by 51 spaces to meet the minimum required by zoning. Later, Joe Geller will address the other specifics of Mr. Tolukian's peer review. This is the 5-story building before we began modifying it. This is the new design. At the suggestion of Ted Tolukian, we moved the apartment building back 10 feet, which created many benefits. By saving more of the rock outcropping and the associated trees, the building has a much lower profile. The view from along the road that runs along the front of the building is improved as well, with the potential to save even more trees. This will become evident when we put the new model into the animation. Overall, the building becomes more integral to the rock outcropping itself. We also set back the 5th floor of the eastern end as suggested by Mr. Hussey and Mr. Tolukian. This reduces the scale of the building in the area closest to the Russet Road abutters. And that's up here. And, as suggested by Mr. Tolukian, we've begun design work on the exterior of the building to break up the linear scale by articulating the exterior and incorporating more variation in use of materials to create the feeling of separate buildings. The 5-story plan from 2012 has evolved into what you are seeing today. When we added the 5th floor to the 4-story building to accommodate the units taken from the S7, we started with the design of the 2012 plan. This is a refinement to the design of the infill building. At the suggestion of Mr. Tolukian, we've created a second rendition so that the 4-unit infill buildings can vary. Please keep in mind that these buildings are so far apart now, with the exception of one instance, that they are not seen at the same time. Mr. Tolukian rightly pointed out that there were some egress issues. We have adjusted the floor plans to address those issues. I won't go into the nuance of the changes, but the building inspector will be reviewing them. This is a before floor plan of the 4-unit building. This is the after that complies with the egress code. This is the previous floor plan for the L-shaped building, and this has been modified to comply as well. There were no egress issues with the 8-unit building on the east side of Independence Drive. As I previously mentioned, we've eliminated 51 parking spaces, and parking now meets with the minimum zoning requirement of 369 spaces. Here's a rendered site plan of Lot E1 on the east side. There are 44 parking spaces and 12 units. Here's a parking analysis of that lot. It shows that there are 24 parking spaces required, that we're providing 44 spaces for a surplus of 20. Here's a rendered site plan of Lot E2. There are now 52 surface spaces and 144 spaces in the garage for a total of 196 spaces. We've eliminated 20 spaces from the previous plan. There are now 140 units on Lot E2. In the analysis, you see that there are 280 spaces required. We're providing 186 for a deficit of 84. Lot E2 is clearly underparked. We anticipate that residents from the apartment building will park on lots E1 and E3. Here's a rendered site plan of E3. Here, there are 58 parking spaces and 12 units. And here's the analysis. There are 24 spaces required, 58 spaces provided, for a surplus of 34. Here's a rendered site plan for the west, Lot W1. We have reduced the parking here by 31 spaces. We now have 71 spaces and 20 units. These units are mostly 3-bedroom units and 2-bedroom units with lofts. They will generate significant parking demands since they are large luxury units and will be occupied by residents that oftentimes have more than 2 cars. It's essential from a marketing perspective that future residents are assured that they will have a space to park when they come home. Here's a parking analysis for the west side. The requirement is 41 spaces. There are 71 spaces provided for a net surplus of 30 spaces. And here's a summary of the parking in the aggregate. As you can see, the 30-space deficit on the east side is matched by a 30-space surplus on the west side. Our plan now currently meets zoning. This will ensure that future residents can find a space to park when they get home at night. It also ensures that there won't be any parking spillover onto the neighboring streets. Although there is a surplus on the west side, we felt it was more important to preserve the green space that we created on the east side where there is a deficit. And so here you see, if we were to try to equalize, take 30 spaces from here, we could always place them over here to at least bring Lot 2, E2, in closer compliance. It'll still have a deficit. But we felt as though this green space is very valuable on this side, and given the amount of green space we were able to create on the west side, we thought it was best to leave it as is shown. I'll now turn the presentation over to Joe Geller, who will talk about many of the other aspects that the peer reviewer raised.
Thank you, Mark. I'm Joe Geller from Stantec Consulting. So as Mark points out, we did remove a number of parking spaces on the plan, and what I'm going to do is go through all of the comments that Mr. Tolukian made. We'll do it this way. We'll show you the comments that were made by Mr. Tolukian, and then we'll show you what we've done to address those comments. So there were a number of questions on this first slide. Saving more trees along the public ways, consider the building placement to minimize tree loss, question of the minimum size of the existing tree that qualifies on the plan, and this was what was the existing tree shown on the plan. And basically the surveyor showed all the significant trees that weren't within wooded areas. I think I explained that last time. So it's generally 4-inch or higher in caliber, or 6 inches or higher in caliber. But each one of the trees was shown on the survey that you have with a caliper size. And then Mr. Tolukian did question about whether we could regrade outside the 40B lot limits, which made us actually take a look at the NCD requirements. And it was a good point, and we realized that you cannot work out in the NCD area if you're grading more than 3 feet of grade change. So that did make some adjustments to the plan to reflect that. So anything we're doing outside of the lot line is we have no more than 3 feet of grade change, or less than 3 feet of grade change. And because of that, there were some areas where we had shown walkways, which we now can't install because they would be grading more than the 3 foot of grade change. So it did modify the plan in that regard, and I'll actually talk about that again in a minute. Oops. So what we've done to respond to those comments, the buildings are already placed to minimize the impact on the trees, and the reality is that because of the grading and the requirements for drainage and other things on the site, which I'll get into later, we really can't move the buildings too much to save any more trees. And we think that we've saved as many of the trees as we can, given the buildings and the requirements that we have for the site design. And as I said, the maximum grade change allowed outside of the 40B is 3 feet. Consider the building alignments with Hancock Village, consider the corner building open and reduce perceived mass. We didn't really feel that separating the building in this corner was something, it actually was something that we did talk about, whether that would make a difference, and we just felt it didn't really actually decrease the building mass. Actually pulling it apart actually made it still like a bigger mass, so we felt like that wasn't something that we wanted to do. And then again, the buildings are placed to minimize the impact on trees. Question was asked about consider adding tree islands and then also where trash was going to be located. One of the things I'll point out now is parking here, and this whole edge of the site was eliminated. One of the things we did do was add a trash pickup and location here for this whole side of the site. So that's been added. We did add tree islands, a number of tree islands along the way here to break up that parking, and that was some of the parking that was reduced as well. And then there was the question of considering paths from each one of the courtyards so that the arrows across. And there are no courtyard pathways in the rear of the courtyards now. All of the rear courtyards are just private patio areas behind the units, and there's no walkways or anything, so we didn't consider connecting there. And where we had, on this side of the site, where we had connections into these courtyards, because of that grade chain issue, we actually had to remove those. So then there was a question about this raised berm along the parking edge. Why is that there? You can see the grades that Mr. Tulkin had shown on the plan. And then another question about standing water in the retention basin, average standing water. So the reason the grading, and it was actually pointed out at the last hearing, that the reason the grading is where it is really for stormwater management. We've had to raise the grade in these areas because of the separation between the water table, the high water line, and the bottom of our drainage structures. So we actually took that down to the lowest possible point we could. As a result of that, we cut into this side of the site, and we actually fill an edge on that side of the site. So we've lowered it as much as we could. What we did do was to sort of feather the grades along that edge. So instead of it being, as Mr. Tulukian termed it, a berm, or a very steep slope and sort of exaggerated, we've tried to feather the grades out so it's a much gentler and more natural grade in those areas where we could do that. In other areas where we were trying to save trees, we actually maintained that grade so that we would save the trees. So it was a balance there between saving trees, cutting down trees, or having the grade changed. As far as the basin is concerned, there would be water in the basin after a significant storm, but it would be empty within 14 hours. So there wouldn't be standing water in that basin 14 hours after the storm. Then the question of the grade and how the berm would be abutting the single-family homes and the impact of what that meant. We've gone back in all of the parking areas on this side of the site, and we'll have hedges, evergreen hedges at the ends of the parking lots. So 4-foot evergreen hedges that would be so when a car pulls into the parking space, it would shield headlights. Then we added evergreen screening behind here as well at the property line. And then where we had a fence that had a lattice topper on it, we now have a solid board fence we added a foot to that fence. So it's a 7-foot high solid board fence. So you can see sort of that's the edge back there. And then we've added a lot of deciduous trees as well. So question was, are trees shown at size when planted? Consider additional landscape buffering, and that's what I just explained, that we did add landscape buffing, and then how the vehicle headlights would impact the neighborhood. So trees now are shown as at planting size, and we've increased the size of some of the plants, particularly the evergreen trees. And then we added the evergreen hedge at the parking, as I explained. We don't believe that there's going to be any headlights protruding, given the fencing, the hedging, the evergreen screening. We really don't believe that that's going to be an issue. And again, we added evergreen trees and increased the height of the fence. A question about consider reversing the orientation of the parked cars and conditional landscape buffering. Again, we addressed this by changing the fence height, adding more evergreen tree screening, and adding the evergreen hedge. And this is, you can see that even with the grades the way they are, that there's no, you see the tops of the cars, and then these evergreens would fill in eventually. It would be a very tall screen, you know, up in here when they grow. But even at planted height, they would screen any car headlights that are coming through there. And this sort of shows that happening in there. So you can see what the headlights do and where the evergreen screening would mitigate that impact. Another question came up about guardrails needed at retaining walls locations, and there are a number of tree wells on this side of the site. And also a question about how the remaining trees are impacted by the grading. We have revised the grading to not have an impact on the trees. And because of the location of the tree wells, they're not adjacent to walkways, and they're not of a height that would require, because of that, would require any kind of guardrail. And then, again, what we did was we added a tree well in this location to protect these big trees in this location and maintain this edge. And we actually put one tree well, continuous tree well, so it's sort of a more elegant tree well as opposed to what we had shown originally. Again, question about minimizing privacy and visibility at the raised berms. Again, we increased the height of the fence and added more evergreens. Consider egress points at different elevations to minimize berming and create better connections to the landscape. There's really a question in the architecture, and as Mark said, we did look at the architecture, revise some of the access points, but given what we could do and couldn't do with the grading, we decided that we really couldn't address that, and that we had addressed the issue by regrading at the edges and the landscaping and all the work that we're doing there. I talked about the grade and regrading the parking lot is really a function of the drainage system. Consider evaluating the parking layout and distribution of cars to minimize the berms. We did reduce the parking on this side, and then we added the landscape. And you know, parking really has been located to protect as many trees as possible. And then the grading is really dictated by DEP stormwater requirements. And so we really can't adjust the grade on this side of the site because of the distance between the groundwater and the top of the site. So that's the west side of the site. On the east side of the site, some of the concerns were consider repositioning the building to minimize grades at the existing tree loss, consider additional screening at the parking, consider tree islands, good preservation of, so we actually did good preservation of the natural resources and views at this point of the site, so there's no impact at that point. So we did, again, increase the height on this side of the site as well of the fence and make it a completely opaque fence. We added additional evergreen trees. At this point, the cars coming into the site, when they turn, this is where they turn, so we added evergreens at this point to really reduce the impact on that. We reduced the grades, both in this parking lot and this parking lot, and I'll get into that in a minute. And then we did add islands in the parking lot as suggested. Again, this was Mr. Tolukian's slide about considering lowering the grades. So what we did here, we were able to, we do have a drainage system under this section of the site, which we couldn't really reduce. But again, cars are coming this way, and there's a pretty significant screen there. This area of the parking lot, we were able to lower 2 feet, so get that down lower, closer to the grade. And then at this parking lot, we were able to reduce the grades an average 3.5 feet across that entire parking lot. And then we added islands in here. And this actually shows you, I think, pretty dramatically what we did in changing that parking lot. So this was the grade that was shown originally in Mr. Tolukian's slide, and this is the grade on the new plan that we just revised. So really feathered the edge again. When I was talking about feathering the edge, instead of having this very steep berm area here as was suggested, we actually graded out a little bit farther where we could and don't have as steep a slope, so it looks more natural and fits into the grades better. Considering adding paths to make better connections to the landscape, again, the challenge there was the grades were too steep to add paths, and that was more of a question of accessibility. And then, as pointed out here, we have a significant setback from the property line here, as a good setback from the abutting family, and then good alignment of our path system that connects up to the existing Hancock Village development. There's also a question about regrading the road to minimize existing tree loss. Challenge there is, as you see the red dots of trees that Mr. Tolukian was suggesting that we might be able to save. If we push the road this way, then we're losing these trees. If we push the buildings this way, we're losing those trees. We really did try to weave the parking in the road into the site. We have a wall, the one wall that we have on the site, besides the tree walls, is behind those buildings, and it's there to preserve and protect these trees. So we think we've done as much as we can to try to protect those trees. Consider a smaller parking lot to minimize existing tree loss. Reevaluate the drainer in order to minimize tree loss. Again, I'm not sure that there's a way to actually do that and meet the fire requirements for fire access that the fire chief required. Consider tree islands, and then consider repositioning the buildings to minimize tree loss. So what we did on this side of the site was we really couldn't, as I said, relocate the road in any meaningful way, so it's where it was before. The building location on 40B lot really does minimize the tree loss, and that's, we've been able to preserve these trees and all of the trees in these areas here. The parking is, as Mark said, as required by zoning for the whole site. The hammerhead here is one of the things that we worked out with the fire department, so we really didn't think we could make any changes to that. And then the accessible paths are really not possible. The question was about considering additional landscape buffering, additional screening, and lowering the grades at the parking location to minimize the berms. So we did add additional screening, evergreen screening at this edge here, additional evergreen screening here. We're able to preserve a couple more trees in here, and the roadway width is per the fire department, so we really couldn't reduce that any further. I think this is really a comment about the abundance of rock outcroppings, trees, and other natural resources, but then the question was, does the survey show existing trees? And this is the area where the survey showed just a wooded edge to this whole area here, because that's where all the existing trees are. Then there was a question about why so much parking on this edge of the site. Mark's addressed some of the parking issues, but I'll talk about what we've done there to change that. Snow storage was a question. Question, which is entry and exit. There actually is only one entrance to the building here. There's a turnaround, but there's an entrance to the lower parking level here and an entrance to the upper parking level at this point. Is the fence set safe height and distance from the ledge drop? And I'll address that. Why is the building so tall? It's a tall building. Consider tree islands. I'll address that again. Consider saving existing mature trees. As Mark said, one of the things that we looked at and we thought was a really great suggestion was, while we had to eliminate parking, bringing the drive-in at this location and maintaining the existing trees and the ledge here, as you could see from that rendering, really did have a significant impact on what the visibility of this corner of the building, which is the most significant part of the building that people will see. So that was a really great suggestion. Consider improving the grades and eliminate retaining walls. Consider setting the building back from the street edge. So we did look at all of those things. And again, as I said, I think the most significant change on the site, from my perspective, really was this one thing, which by maintaining the ledge here, maintaining the trees in this area, we really will have a major impact. And while we lose parking close up to the building, we do have a reasonable access, and then we're able to maintain the parking access to the back, the fire access to the back of the building with a grasscrete fire lane. Sure. Mark told me to go fast. We did add islands in this parking lot as well to add landscaping and add trees on the edges of the parking lot. We moved the parking away from the property line, so we actually were able to push the parking by grading into this side of the site. We were able to push the parking as far away from the neighboring butters properties as we could. As I said, we eliminated and realigned the parking. The fence will comply with building code and safety code requirements and will be placed in a way so that it protects people from here from falling into that side of the site. Excess snow will be removed from the site. Chestnut Hill Realty does remove snow from all of the Hancock Village properties today, and would continue to do it on this part of the property as well. And save the rock outcropping. And then incorporated the rock outcroppings into the landscape. So instead of the walls that we were proposing as big retaining walls, we'd actually use stone from the site to build the retaining walls and as more of a riprap type wall. And then, as Mark had pointed out, we pushed the building back 10 feet from the previous location, which allowed us to get more landscape and edge treatment to the front sides of the building as well, and provide additional screening at the front of the building. It was a question of how the mechanical systems would be screened, also to how we clarify the height of the building and consider less rock excavation. The mechanical systems, and we're still working on this, but we set back to the middle of the building so to avoid visibility of those systems from the ground or from other vantage points. The elevation is approximately elevation 252 to the top of the building. And rock excavation will be minimized. That was one of the benefits of moving the building back a little bit, and also saving that large outcrop in the front, is that we're reducing the amount of ledge that will be removed from the site. Consider a stepping building with a sloping glade, consider more trees, and then again, this is the image that you saw before. What we did is we went out and we looked at sort of where the trees are and got the heights of the existing trees. And so these trees are sort of, they're not pictures of these trees, but they're models of what the trees would look like that are existing today on that corner of the site, which if you went out there today, this is sort of the height of the tree that you would see there. We also added significant evergreens on this edge of the site and this edge of the site, sort of frame the entrance going into the site so that you won't see as much as you were seeing in the previous proposed renderings. So, a summary of what we've done. We shifted the location of the apartment building, and that enabled us to preserve more of the large rock outcropping in the east end of the apartment building, along with the mature trees located there. We refined the design and exterior of the apartment building, and we're still working on that. We modified the exterior of the infill buildings. We revised the floor plans to address the egress concerns. We reduced the parking by 51 spaces to meet the minimum required by zoning. We increased the landscape buffer to shield from headlights. We added tree islands in various places along the parking areas. We made a solid board fence instead of the lattice topper that we had, and we added 1 foot in height to the fence to ensure that we don't have any impact on the abutting neighbors from light spillage. We lowered the grades in the select parking lots where we could. We adjusted the grades wherever we could to blend into the existing topography. So, I think that's where we're at this point, and we're happy to answer any of your questions.
Mr. Geller, could you run through the, I know Mr. Levin did already, but could you run through the parking explanation one more time?
I'd rather have Mark run through the parking.
I don't blame you.
Which aspect?
The calculation. Run through the entire presentation, but move a little more slowly for those of us who are a little slower. I'm most interested in the locations where you have less than the number of required spaces and shifting to locations where you have surplus. If you could run through that.
Okay. As I had indicated, we now comply with the zoning. And I started with Lot E1. This is the first area to the east of Independence Drive. And we have 44 spaces and 12 units. And here's the analysis that goes with that. So in the center column, you see that there's 24 spaces required based on the multiplier and the number and types of units. We have 44 spaces, gives us a surplus of 20. So that's this lot here. Thornton Road is right here. Independence Drive is right here. Here is Lot E2 that houses the large apartment building of 140 units. And on there, we have 52 surface spaces over here and 144 spaces in the garage for a total of 196 to service those 140. We've eliminated, as Joe mentioned, the 20 parking spaces right here to take advantage of shifting the building back. So here's the analysis. You are required 280 spaces by zoning. We're providing about 196 for a deficit of 84. And I'll show you on the large plan where that deficit would, at least in part, be made up. Here's the rendered site plan for Lot E3. This is the BFW Parkway. And here there are 58 spaces and 12 units. And the analysis in the middle column required by zoning is 24. We have 58 provided, so you have a surplus of 34. I'll skip.
Okay, let me interrupt you for a minute and ask you a
Sure.
question. So you've got a surplus in E3, which offsets the deficit in E1 and E2.
There's only a deficit in E2.
E2,
There's
okay.
surpluses on E1 and E3.
Okay.
And I'll skip forward to the summary. So here you see E1 at the top has a
Yep.
surplus of 20. That was the first image. That's right along Independence. E2 has a deficit of 84. E3, a surplus of 34. So you have between the two, E1 and E3, you have a surplus of 54 spaces to offset the deficit of 84 spaces. Ergo, the net deficit of 30.
Okay. And are there paths leading from surplus to units where there's a deficit?
Yes, there is.
They are accessible?
Yes, they are.
Okay. And the calculations are based upon our current zoning bylaw requirements? Is
That's
that correct?
correct.
That's how you get your number?
Yes.
Okay.
I have one question. Does that include the possible reduction for the affordable units, reduction in the parking requirement?
No, it doesn't.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I'm sorry, are you expecting that the people on the east will walk over to use the parking in the west, or were you, I mean, one of the things I heard you had said earlier is that you were expecting that because of the size of the units on the west, there may be a need in excess of what's required by zoning. They're, big luxury units. Some of those units will require more than two spaces. And so are you expecting that people from the east are going to walk to the west? Are you expecting those excess spaces on the west really will be for the west? And then I guess that leads to the question, you're also creating large luxury units on the east. Won't there be a similar need or a desire by those residents for more spaces?
Well, the spaces on the east, the units on the east are obviously concentrated in the big building, 140. Those are not, although they're certainly luxury, they are not as large. They're only, ones and twos. There are no 3 bedrooms in the large building.
Right.
Nor are there the lofts. But to answer your first question, there's one scenario where the west would provide parking for the residents on the east side, and that is that As this gets filled up by the units, well, this lot in particular, gets filled up by the demand from the apartment building, then there might be circumstances where the residents here would park over here. It's certainly no further than what residents today are walking to get to their parking space from their unit.
Is it, and I'm sure you've looked at it, it's not possible or practical to create more parking under the building itself?
If you're referring to the apartment building,
I'm sorry, yes.
right now we have 2 levels of parking. And, you know, we've done a lot of very fancy engineering to be able to do it in such a manner that by building it into the hill, we've tried to minimize the blasting. To go down yet another level is probably feasibly very, very difficult.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question. Sure. Joe, I think this would be something you would handle. You've moved back the apartment building by 10 feet, and you've told us that that will significantly reduce the amount of rock outcropping that will be removed. Have you done a quantitative study of how much less?
Yeah, we haven't done that yet.
Okay.
And I would say that there's going to be less ledge removed because we're going to try to save in that 10-foot area and the area between the building and the roadway as much of that existing ledge as we can. I think the more significant savings in the outcropping is the area where the 20 parking spaces were. And it's not a huge amount, but it is definitely a reduction in the ledge removal.
Well, I know there's concerns about how much trucking will be
Yep.
done, so.
Yeah, we
you
can
haven't done
definitely
that.
calculate. We'll have that number.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Did you explore options of stepping back the building, particularly on the corner?
Stepping back the height of the building. We actually did step back the building. So the fifth floor now is stepped back
By
12 feet.
12 feet.
Yeah.
So, and is it all the way around the building or just at that?
It's on 3 sides.
Actually, if you extended that edge of the building straight across on the 5th floor, it goes straight, and it's 12 feet back from this back corner here, this end here, and then 12 feet on the sides. So instead of it going all the way out to the sort of the bulge in the building there,
Yeah.
it follows the line of the existing of the rest of the floors, and then it's designed in a way that the materials are a much the contrasting quality of the materials, the color, and all of that, and the material itself would really fade back into the building, so that that's why that image you sort of didn't see the top part of the top floor, because it's stepped back, and you're sort of losing that whole 5th floor, that part of the building.
Could I amplify on that a little bit? I think you maybe
You can try.
I think you maybe responded to my suggestion at the last hearing that it might be possible to reduce the number of floors on this side of the building and add floors on this side of the building. Is that right?
Mhm.
Well, there is an answer to that, and I think the architect perhaps should respond to it. We've touched on it during the working sessions.
Right now, by virtue of adoption of the International Building Code, you're now permitted to build 5 stories of wood frame over a podium. If we went to a 6th floor at any part of that building, we would have to go to steel construction, and it obviously raises the cost of construction substantially.
But the impact of a wood structure means that, how does this filter back to your question?
Well, it means that if he goes, what I suggested was taking some units off the floor, some of the floor off on one end, add it to the other
Right.
end, which would make them more than 4 or 5 stories, which is allowed now, I think, by the code. Go to 6 or 7 stories. If that happens, the whole building
So then
has
they'd have
be
to
made
do
out of-
structural steel. Okay.
out of structural
I
steel,
understand.
et cetera, and that's clearly an
Hey,
economic
and I-
issue.
Right, okay, I understand.
Thanks.
The, I'm sorry. Can I
No,
ask?
that was actually my question. I wanted to ask about the stepping back of the east end of the building, so you jumped it. The building is wide, so, I'm sorry, just to pursue this. So 12 feet around, it's set back on all three sides of that corner?
Yes.
So it really is quite skinny?
It's the same width as this section of the building. So if you can imagine the width of this section continuing straight and then lopping off the end. Let me see, the image. So what you see here, and then across, and then on the backside is a setback of the 5th floor by 12 feet.
Okay.
Where we're seeing the gray?
Yes, the lighter, well, yes, this gray here.
Yeah.
Up here. Now, when we finish modeling this, we'll put it into the animation, and you may be able to get a better feel for the impact that it has from Asheville Road in particular.
And looking at this, will I see a mechanical tower?
No.
If it's placed in the center, it will not pop up in that?
I will tentatively say no. We're working that out.
Okay.
I do not believe there will be any mechanical seen.
Okay. All set?
Yep.
In terms of the grading and the berms, the suggestion was made at the last hearing that the grade reflect the undulating form of the landscape. Recognizing, I understand from your comment that you need some degree of raising the grade so that you can install the kind of drainage system that you want to install. Is it possible to follow the grade, so to speak? Do you understand my question?
So where we could, we have tried to follow the grade as much as possible.
I mean, even assuming the raised,
Yeah, and that's where I showed you that very different change in grade on where we were able to reduce it 3.5 feet. That was really, looking at that, we had a better separation of the water table, and we were able to actually follow the grade much more closely with the drainage system. Actually requires us to do more ledge removal in that area. That's actually a place where we've actually added ledge removal so that we push the grade down. On the other side of the site, it's pretty limiting because the water table sort of flows down at that grade. So we really couldn't follow that sort of undulation. But what we ended up doing was, basically cutting at the Hancock Village building side of the site, cutting it as low as we could, and then trying to grade that down and feather that grade out a lot better, to the extent we could. But then if we did more of that, we'd be losing more trees. So it really became a balance of that, as well as the grades. We wanted to be sort of consistent with the grade as opposed to trying to grade like this, because that would, I think, be more jarring. So we tried to have the grade be very consistent and then balance out. I think when it's done and all the trees are in and all the plants are in, that actual grade is going to be much less visible because there's very little place where it's actually exposed. Most of it is covered with planting and trees and landscaping. So, and I think with the other things we've added, we've actually mitigated that issue.
so it will not have the appearance of essentially a raised bed.
Yeah, I never thought it did. So I think that, my sense of it was that the grades, where we could, the grades were feathered as much as possible. Where they weren't, we would plant those edges as much as possible so that it would take the curse off of any of that grading. So it wouldn't feel that steep at the edge. And particularly since, where we saved all those large trees, you have a significant expanse between the edge of the parking lot and the fence line. And so that it's taken up in a very large area. So I really don't think you're going to experience that the way, and I think we sort of showed that in these plans.
Yeah, I would say that, although I appreciate Mr. Tilikian's comment, I think the notion is that in existing Hancock Village, you've got what appear to be multiple structures with party walls, with sort of that townhouse style. Whereas in the revised plan, you've got individual structures. So that sense of, different structures, different heights following the gradation, sort of, it takes a little off of that issue.
Yeah, I think it's really challenging to try to do that with the type of building that we have, for sure. And you're still going to see that in the existing Hancock Village development. So as you drive into the site, you're still going to see that grade change. You're still going to see what's happening with the undulating part of the site. So you're not losing that context, which I think is part of why we did it the way we did.
Other questions? Gentlemen? No? The list of questions, somebody want to kick me under the table and...
Do you want to add the things for it?
I think, talking about the questions raised by the public at the last hearing.
The questions that have been raised to date by both the public, the questions that were raised by the ZBA, you've been tracking. I just want to make sure that we have gotten answers to questions raised.
Well, one member of the public asked at the last hearing whether there'd be an actual study that assessed the impact of the lights on the surrounding properties. I know it was discussed tonight, but...
Okay, will there be I assume
Well, I
it's a
think
light pour over.
I think that animation that we showed you is a pretty accurate animation that shows what the light impacts are. So we'll show that in the final animations that we present.
Okay, and when you show that, is that based on whatever the science is that engineers do to achieve this?
Yeah, well, it's kind of interesting, because I don't know, the sciences of this are a little I don't think they're as defined as you might think, but we've actually used the technique that we use for modeling, and we've been able, we can show the accuracy of how that model was created. And then we used the height of a car headlight, and the car itself is moving in. It's built as a car. And we've used, the accuracy can be authenticated, I think.
I think I know the science behind it. The headlights are here, and there's shrubs, which would prevent one layer of light, and then a fence. And, if the calculations are correct, meaning the fence height is high enough, and if the drawings are accurate, then I think the science is simply math, that the lights wouldn't penetrate through the fence, provided that the fence is higher than the cars. That's my interpretation of it.
I think that we can show with the sections that we showed, and
Yeah, as long as the calculations are accurate, where the fence is and where the lights are, I don't think that there'd be further studies necessary.
was the question about just lighting on the site, or was it just the headlights?
The question that was asked,
Both.
it was both.
Yeah.
Okay.
It seemed like the major concern, if I'm addressing the public's comments, was that the light from parking cars or traveling cars in the lanes would splash into their living rooms or private backyards or just invade their privacy. So I think that, by putting up a barrier of a fence, that if it's higher than the vehicles, you would, and it's a it's not an opaque structure, and it's a wooden or graded, some type of structure that stops light from going through, that as long as it's higher than the vehicle's lights, it seems to
And
accomplish
that's
its
what we
goal.
showed in that animation.
I'm gonna,
I think in terms of the light, the rest of the lighting on the site, I think Mr. Salukian commented on the adequacy of the light.
He did. Question was asked, would there be a presentation of a 3D model perspectives without leaves? I think, Mr. Levin, you actually answered that question the last time.
And the answer is still yes. We just wanted to wait until we got the new building modeled out so we could insert that in. as
Thank you.
well as the changes that Stantec has done.
Great, thank you. There was a question asked, I believe this was by a member of the public, which is, the bioretention basin was not represented on the 3D model animations. Why not? This was drawing L504, the west parcel near Building 4.
Actually, the grades of the detention basin were shown, it just wasn't shown, it was shown as lawn area because that's what it'll look like the majority of the time when there isn't water after a storm. So we can make it much clearer as to where that is in the animation when we respond
Please.
with the new animation.
And lastly,
Do you want me to answer number 4?
if you would,
Yeah, to number 4, how much standing water will accumulate in the bioretention basin? What I understood that you said was that the water, for a significant storm, there will be water, and that the water will be gone within 14 hours.
Yes, and that's a 100-year storm.
That's the next question,
And
yes.
I think, the engineers will review this with the peer reviewer for the engineering and the stormwater. There is freeboard in the basin, as much as I think 3 feet of freeboard, but I don't think it's intended to go to the entire 3 feet. So that's something that they can review together.
That's all right. That's all right.
and then the last one that I have is, and again, this was a question raised by a member of the public. Drawing A7 shows a date of January 25th, 2012. Is this the plan that was rejected previously by Mass Development? Is this, let me rephrase the question. Is this the same plan? And if not, can you briefly identify major differences?
The footprint of the building is the same. When, as I had mentioned in my presentation, when we put units, moved units from the S7 to the 5th floor, we were working off of that plan from 2012, because that was the same footprint, only now it was 5 stories. Subsequent to that, we've done 2 things. One is we've done 3 things. Shifting it back into the hill is significant in terms of the impact. But in terms of changes to the design of the building itself, we have, the discussion that I tried to explain in terms of cutting back the 12 feet at the end closest to the russet abutters. And we've obviously done with, some encouragement from Mr. Hussey as well as Mr. Talukian, we've really started to work the skin of the building to, use architectural design techniques to make certain areas look like 3 stories or 4 stories visually by using different materials and different articulation in the building.
Okay. And let me just follow that up with one other question, which is, and in that prior iteration in the S7 district, okay, you with me so far?
S7? Okay.
Yes, because what you're saying is we've
Yes.
added height to our building,
Yes.
right? Because we've removed housing and opened up S7.
Without a doubt. We had,
Okay. And in that prior iteration,
yes.
what were the number of buildings that were within S7?
S7 previously had 12 buildings.
Okay.
They currently have 10. Although they are now smaller, there were more 8-unit buildings previously. On the original plan, there were 76 units in the S7. There are now 44.
Okay, thank you. That's exactly what I was asking. Thank you. Is that it? Is it the list? Number 3?
There was a
What are
request to
the-
provide Asheville Road perspectives within the context of the site.
Okay. There was, I'm not sure who made that request, but there was a request that you provide a perspective, an Asheville Road perspective, within the context of the site. Do you remember?
What does that mean?
That's what I'm trying to figure out.
Maybe it's planning staff person.
I don't think it was ZBA. I don't think that's a ZBA question.
Perspective, are they talking about the drive-through?
This is it.
We have a rendering.
This is what you were referring to.
We have a rendering, so that question.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I just want to make sure that he's gotten answers to questions. Okay. Any other questions, CBA? All right. Thank you. Yeah, sure. Okay, I'd like to move on to start a discussion, because I think it's important that, as I said in the last hearing, we've got to start a discussion about the design elements. And we have to, for purposes of this discussion, suspend for the moment the broader decision-making. Because in order to be able to consider all of the options, we obviously have to consider the modified plan. And I think we need to give some guidance. So I want to be careful here and be very clear that while we are discussing the elements that we've seen that go into the design, it does not foreclose broader issues that have yet to be decided by the ZBA. Okay? So I want to focus on what it is we've seen as it's been modified, and I'd like everybody to sort of weigh in what you like, what you don't like, where you see improvement, where you see failure, to the degree you know the answer. I'm getting blank stares. Mr. Hussey,
No, you're
resident architect, do you
You're
want to?
still getting blank stares, I think. First place, you're talking about site design, massing, and rather than architectural, the visual
Yeah, I'm
style.
not talking, right, I'm not talking about visual style.
You're talking about just site design and massing.
Yes.
okay? And you want to know if there are other possible solutions that should be discussed, or you're talking about modifications?
Before
to
we,
the existing,
before we
or-
get to whether there are other solutions, I want to hear whether I want to hear what are the good things about the proposal as modified that's on the table, what are the bad things?
Why don't you maybe ask them specific questions, or maybe start with your thinking, so that you kind of stimulate some,
That's not what
Okay.
he wants to do.
well,
I'll start.
Go ahead.
It sounds like a major concern, if I'm hearing the comments of the public, were one of which was parking. So let's address parking first.
Well, let me be careful here. I'm not proposing
Right.
what you would traditionally would think of as deliberation. I want to know your personal
My personal opinion,
view of what we've seen from design to this
Okay.
point.
from design to today, parking is acceptable to me. I'm of the notion that 2 cars per unit in general is very liberal in this town. So I think that they've made the best accommodations possible, given the space and given the amount of units. Is it likely for the east side to walk to the west side? Yes. Is it ideal for the east side? No. But anyone that lives in this town would be sympathetic and understands that you may not have a second car directly in front of your unit, or even in remote sight of your unit. Given the land, given the function and design of this, I've tried to figure out where they could put more parking to accommodate that, but at the same time not sacrifice trees, common area, flow of the unit, of the design. And again, my personal opinion, since you're asking for it, is I'm all for less parking. So that is my opinion on parking. I think that the design today as presented, I feel like people will have parking, and if they don't, it'll be the same situation as now. There will always be a need for parking. There will always be a need for parking, no matter where you are in this town. So,
Okay.
that confuse you?
Not at all.
Good.
And let's take the smaller buildings. Bulk, shape, design, location.
I like that the units are in the corners. I think that's a good use of the space to have them abutting in the west sides. They have the unit in the top left-hand corner there, big building in the top right corner. They considered breaking that up. Obviously, it didn't make sense. I think that by breaking it up, you actually would have to force it out. So I think they're, again, doing the best that they can to get the units that they need and want to have. I like how the west side remains a little bit more simpatico with the current design of Chestnut Hill Realty, whereas the east side, I mean, the structure, the main focus there will be that building, and that's the side that it ended up on. You could pick your poison, basically. Where do you want to put this building? But I think that where it is, you have modest housing all over this neighborhood, and within Chestnut Hill Realty, this is one big structure, but given the grading and given the input, I just, to accomplish the goal here, which they are entitled under 40B to accomplish, I don't know, and I don't think that we've seen or heard any better suggestions, and I think that the design presented to us as is, given, I'm sure there'll be more additions and edits, but this is, it's solid, it's sound, I think, as of right now, as far as location of units, size, and accommodations for, fire and safety was something I was so concerned about originally. I think that they've made a very good effort to accommodate that, Is it ideal? I mean, nothing, it's never going to be perfect, okay? And that's what I've come to realize. But the chief has approved this, and if we can get a truck in and a truck out and hit that 24 feet or whatever that number was, I mean, that's what it is. It's been approved in this town before.
Are you suggesting zoning's a balance?
Not at all. I'm just saying that in this particular, given the authority we have and given the rules and guidelines that we operate under, and given, this has been a lengthy process, and we've got very, very good professionals that are working on this right now on all sides. If you have to take a balancing act, I think that, I'm okay with this project. I'm okay with the location of the housing right now. This image here that is on here, I mean, this is burnt into my brain, and I'm always trying to think of, The Sims, building a city, and where would I put things? And I just don't know where else I would possibly put it, or how else I would do it. So I have to say that, to some degree, this is in my opinion, it's okay.
Okay. I'll jump in if nobody else wants to speak. Let me say that what they've presented in the most recent iteration is so much better than the initial presentation. I would say in particular because of what you've reduced in the S7 district and the ability to preserve something of what people are calling the green belt. I don't know what the green belt was there for initially. And frankly, it's not within my scope to make that decision. But the very fact that you've been able to at least leave a fair portion of it and a fair number of trees, I think makes for a better project. The location of the buildings in the corners, I think, helps, creates a streetscape, it makes sense. I have concerns about the amount of pavement. I have concerns about the amount of parking. But I, like you, there is this debate in Brookline about whether you have more or whether you have less parking. Traditional zoning codes were all about make sure there's more parking because otherwise we'll wind up with a problem. And lately, the motivation has been to reduce the amount of parking, make cities for people. I'm admittedly a skeptic of that viewpoint because my viewpoint is people who want parking, who want cars, are going to buy cars, they're going to use cars, and if you don't provide them with parking spaces, they'll find them elsewhere. Whether that's in front of your house or somebody else's house, they'll find it. So the number of spaces, if I take it in the aggregate, and assuming the calculation is correct, the number of spaces that matches the code, that makes sense to me. The question about where you allocate and how you allocate, and whether people will walk from one side to the other side, it was interesting to me. Your response was a typical North Brookline response, because in North Brookline, where there is no parking, you're willing to walk all the way across town just to find a space for your car. I don't know that that's the case in South Brookline, but assuming that is the case, then they have, again, in the aggregate, provided the number of spaces that they seem to feel would be adequate for the number of units, and which matches up with what our bylaw provides for. So I'm not offended so much by the number of spaces, whether, to use Mr. Talukian's term, the sheets make sense or there's a better way to lay out the sheets. It seems to me we have testimony, at least tonight, that there's no better way to lay out the sheets. I'll be very curious to hear from peer review what his comment is, but, you know, in terms of the larger building, and it is a large building, the size concerns me, but I understand the dynamic. And the trade-off is, and Mr. Levin said it, trade-off is, you know, you reduce the density in S7, but for them to gain the number of units that they feel is economically required for this project, they need to add them somewhere. And they've added them by concentrating them in one building on a high point of the site. I'm not concerned for the pudding stone outcropping. I actually like the fact that they've buried the building into the outcropping, and therefore you've got essentially two levels that are going down. Frankly, I wish they could figure out a way to add more parking to that building. You're smiling. You probably assumed somebody was going to say that. I wish you could figure out a way, whether it's stackers, so that you could take more of the parking off of the other areas. I think that would be helpful. I don't know that there's a solution. I know you've added, to a degree, a staged facade at the corner, which is, I mean, frankly, if we're talking about that building, we're really focused on that, because that's the impact to third parties. And while I appreciate the fact that it steps back 12 feet, I think that's what you said, it would be nice if there was a solution that somehow pushed it back or lowered it further I'm not an engineer, I'm not an architect. I take it you've explored all options, but I'm trying to be honest with you about issues that are a concern to me, and that's one of them. The mass of the building itself, recognizing that it's internal, but the mass of the building it made me think of those pictures you see of the Schlosses in Germany sitting on top of the mountaintops, particularly as it curves around the road and you basically have the retaining wall. I assume you will explore options to break that up and ways in which you can make that appearance less Schloss-like. You can quote me on that. I think that would be important. Schloss. You don't speak German, Mark. I think it's premature for us to discuss the aesthetics of the design, which you suggested, so I don't even want to go into that. The issues about hammerheads versus turnarounds seems to me really spin off of safety, accessibility and safety. And if our fire department has reviewed the turnarounds and the width of the parking areas and has said these meet his requirements, then I think that's the most important factor here. And if our fire department has said, we want access to the rear of the building, and that has driven your addition of a drive to the rear of the building, and now you've modified that by pushing it in, removing some of your parking, and the sort of side benefit to that is that you can push the larger building in. That's great. I'm particularly interested in the fact that the fire department has looked at it and said, this is safe or this meets our needs. Have I missed anything?
No, I think not. Just, I would add, I think the refinements that the team has developed around the site work, the grading, the saving of trees, the minor movements of buildings to retain more green space, the elimination of more parking, which actually we've even picked up a little bit more at the last working session. I thought they could eliminate even more parking, and they have eliminated a few. And now that they're down to what's required by the zoning, I guess I don't know if I can push for any more. I worked out a whole scenario where we were ripping off of the beta formula of 1.5 ratio, parking ratio 1.5, where it got down to even 341 instead of 369 that he's at now. But I think if he's met with the zoning, I'm not sure we can push that too far.
But I saw him taking notes. He's thinking about stackers now.
No, I don't think so. But anyway,
I bet you have.
I think the apartment building, absent a drastic reduction in the program, I think they've pushed and refined that building as much as they can, quite frankly. The only other thing to do would be to take more units out of that building, a whole floor or half a floor at the east end, and redistribute them into the other buildings, infill buildings around, and I'm not sure that...
You mean the S7
the S7,
and right.
Right, I'm not sure...
Yeah, that's the major trade-off here.
Right, exactly.
Again,
So-
buying into the notion of the number of units and the economics of it, that's the trade-off.
I think I might at some point make some remarks about overall design and other possible options. I'm not sure they're feasible, but be interesting to discuss them at some point.
Do you want to raise them now?
Well, no, let's stick with your agenda for the moment, and then perhaps at the end.
This is my agenda.
Okay. The neighbors have been pretty adamant about retaining, as I understand it, from both what they've said and other people have told me, they're limiting the height of the infill buildings to the 2.5 stories. That I understand was part of the original 1947 decision and agreement with the town. I think that and the developers have done their best, and they've even reduced the height in some cases over these past two meetings. What eliminates, however, is the possibility of trading off height for more green space. And by that I mean, and this has not been discussed at the working sessions or any place, if you took these two buildings, for instance, and stacked them, and if you took this building and stacked it here, and took these two buildings and stacked them on the VFW.
Well, let's not use technical terms. Added floors.
Yeah, what did I say?
Stack them.
Well, okay, but it increases the height of those buildings.
Right.
It reduces some of the drainage problems, it gets more units right on the major thoroughfares for fire and emergency access. But what you're giving up is more tall buildings on the site, and I'm not sure that anybody wants to get into that, but it would be interesting to explore the extreme of that, of course, is going to a village garden city rather than a garden village solution, which was tried evidently by the developer many years ago in the Boston side of the development, and which was been, well, I shouldn't say ridiculed, but it's been addressed by some of the neighbors, and it was addressed by the city of Boston as being a ridiculous solution. But in fact, you know, if you put up a single tower right here, it'd be a very interesting solution, and then you'd have your green space and everything. I think we're way past these solutions, but I want to.
Well, we're certainly past that one, because it's not within the confines of this proposal. Anybody else?
Do we know, I'm posing as a question, within the S7 district, within the green belt, is the developer precluded from putting any other buildings at a future date? Are these green spaces now, what's left of it, are they green spaces?
Well,
Would you like me to respond?
I would
Yes.
love for you to respond if you have an answer.
I do.
microphone.
Couple of ways to answer that. The only way to absolutely ensure no further development is through a restriction.
Okay.
The other answer is that whatever you should decide, any changes subsequently, they have to seek an amendment. But in terms of a permanent change, it's through a restriction.
Even within the confines of the 40B lot, you know, whatever, the
Correct.
Okay.
Because that way, even if you've got two lines of control. One is through regulation, your decision, and the other is a restriction on the deed, on the land.
And to clarify, that is normal procedure for a 40B proceeding, is for the board to, at its option, impose restrictions within the context of the development. Is that?
No, I think perhaps you were deliberately rephrasing. I didn't say that. Certainly, there are discussions with an applicant with respect to whether the applicant is willing to impose a restriction. I think that's the better.
But
I
it
think
is
there's
it's part of the process.
No, there's a difference between a restriction and a condition.
Okay.
The condition is, you know, we grant the comprehensive permit subject to your doing A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. A restriction is like a legal agreement entered into that gets recorded at the Registry of Deeds, whereby the developer, separate and apart from the 40B, if they're willing to do it, would say, I hereby agree. It could be a conservation restriction or another type of restriction. They say, I hereby agree not to develop this area any further.
But
That-
it's within the purview of this proceeding that we can discuss,
Yes.
Condition, yes.
request.
But you can,
Negotiate.
Condition.
Yeah.
I think you understand the difference between
Yeah.
a zoning condition, a regulation, and a deed restriction. And the question is, can you impose a condition that requires a deed restriction? And, correct?
Yes.
And my recommendation is that would be a conversation, I think, and it could be part of this
And it
process.
can be part of
yes.
this process.
Correct.
Okay. So, again, I wanted to clarify that as part of the 40B proceeding, we can negotiate discuss.
Correct.
And then maybe eventually reach an agreement
Correct.
as to that kind of restriction and/or conditions.
I mean, I raise it only in that, you know, the maximization, and the preservation of green space within the green belt. Certainly, I wouldn't want to see it further chipped away at a later date. We've moved buildings out of the green belt to added height to the apartment building to address that. And so, I guess in my mind, the idea is that and I like the fact that, you know, that there is more green now, and I know it's important to the neighborhood. We'd want to make sure that that is preserved. I guess I'll just to echo that in terms of the parking, I mean, I think it's the right amount of parking. That this project is not on an MBTA station. It's not public, really, for all intents and purposes, all that accessible to public transportation. People expect and need cars in this area of Brookline, and so while we're striving, I think, to reduce parking in certain areas, I feel like that's, you know, the emphasis on that is areas where, you know, that are on the Green Line or on a major bus line. So I feel like the parking is the right number. I am concerned about the distribution, that it's in the wrong place. And I suppose, you know, maybe people will walk across Independence Drive to get to their parking space. I don't know. I would like to see it redistributed to put the parking where it's needed. And I guess I'm actually a little more serious about the stacker idea. I would hope that maybe that you would look into it to see, is that a possibility that makes sense? And quite frankly, I think people would, you know, they value being able to walk not too far to their car and not across a relatively busy street. I'm not in favor of, I'll just say, I'm not in favor of stacking the buildings in the S7 district. I think that's going in the wrong direction. While I'm not an architect, it just seems to me that going from the single-family residences on Beverly and Russet into Hancock Village, into these, you know, low garden-style apartments, there should be a transition that makes sense. And a four-story building, just in my mind, doesn't seem to be right. But I defer to people who practice in that, who practice in that every day. That's not me. I'm pleased by with respect to the apartment building itself, the stepping back on the east side where it is visible from Russet Road and that neighborhood. The rest of it, I mean, albeit it is a very large building, but it's within, I feel like the impacts of looking at a large building are going to be felt more by the residents of Hancock Village. The neighborhood, I think it's been addressed a little bit from the Russet Road neighborhood. They've stepped it back. They've left the rock, the outcroppings, the pudding stone rock outcroppings. They've left the trees. I suppose we'll have a better sense of that when we see it in the 3D model, but it looked like a good, they made a good attempt to reduce the visual impact on it. The only other thing I guess I will mention, I don't know if we're getting out of what we're supposed to be talking about, but I would like, it's important to see, and I know that there's no certainty that it will happen, but I would like to see egress directly onto VFW Parkway. And as this proceeds along, I would hope that the Chestnut Hill Realty will pursue that with, diligence and really go after it. I think that would be a huge benefit, not only to the Hancock Village, but I think it'll help with the traffic impacts of people exiting and entering on the east side of the project in terms of the neighborhood.
Well, except you have to then motivate people to use that as their means of egress.
Well, and so, and we talked earlier about this, and again, I realize we may be getting off topic. There's certainly things that can be done to the roads in terms to discourage people from using Asheville, and and I would think that people would be more interested in getting right on a major thoroughfare rather than driving through neighborhood streets at 10 miles an hour. But excuse me. But things can be done, I think, to encourage people not to use the Asheville Road. And again, I realize that's certainly it's not a certainty that egress can happen, but I think it's important that the developer pursue it.
I agree with that.
Well, let me ask you a question. How many can a parcel be subject to multiple 40B projects?
Are you asking me?
I'm asking anybody who has the answer.
You can answer.
Either one of you.
Once they've designated the parcel as a 40B parcel, if they want to do something else on it, they'd have to come back to the amendment process, amending the same company.
They would have to amend the 40B decision.
Yeah, right.
And in amending a 40B decision, is it subject to the same generous parameters the statute provides the ZBA otherwise?
Yes, and it also depends whether it's considered material or non-material, if they're going to...
So it's the same extreme limitations?
The same framework, yes.
Okay.
I'd like clarification. Are we talking about an alteration to the 40B plan within the foreseeable future, or 5, 10, 15 years down the pike? Which are you referring to? Or both?
Both.
Both, okay.
I am riffing off of Mr. Book's question, which is, could there be further development? Let's assume this was approved in what they've presented, which is you've got, you've made the trade-off, which is bigger building, less in S7, and you've got Greenbelt. And let's assume no restriction. Could they then come back to amend the 40B? Either, they'd have to amend it in any case, but could they re-subdivide, decide on another 40B within that Greenbelt area, and we're subject to the same limiting factors? You use better euphemisms than I'm using. Goes to your issue.
Can I expand that question too? If the permit is granted under 40B under the current presentation and they decide to amend it, and if the statute was to be amended, is there a grandfathering of what was in existence at the time of the original, which would then be amended? Or, and maybe this depends on the way our legislature in its wisdom decides to amend it, assuming they do, would they be able to come back under original parameters, or would it be under change parameters?
It's a very interesting question, but I would think it would be under the change parameters. I don't think you get the benefit of grandfathering if you're going to do an entirely new aspect of the...
Of course, it depends on the scope of their amendment request too, but my guess is that there would not be a grandfathering, but I don't know that. Maybe have you ever seen it? Has there been an amendment to the statute?
To the the regs get not constantly, but periodically, the regulations get, as do the guidelines. I don't know if the statute's ever been...
The statute has been the statute since 1969.
But
Which is why
the changes to the regulations
at some point it might get amended, but
material that changes the
Okay.
regulations over the years.
I don't know if that clarifies anything, but,
Do you want to comment on?
do you want my comments? I'm used to
do.
going last,
I
so
do.
it's okay. No, you don't. But anyway, so let me chime in and say that my overall opinion is that I am pleased that the developer has scaled back its proposal significantly. I think it has responded to the peer review in many ways. I do share a concern about parking, but parking is an inevitable part of a development project. I think that the number of spaces may be right. And I know that there's a great deal of neighborhood skepticism about whether people will cross the road to get to their cars, much like the old adage, will the chicken cross the road, or why did the chicken cross the road? Well, I do believe that people will cross the road if that's where their car is. We're talking about a couple of 100 yards, and while we are, as a society, headed toward more walking and less driving, and more bicycles and more shared rides, I fear the day when we will no longer want to walk across the street to get to our cars, assuming we still have them. I think that if that's where your parking space is, if that's where your car is, that's where you'll want to get to it. So I'm less concerned about the distribution. I appreciate the fact that there is less parking in the less populated part of the development, even if it is supposedly a deficit, if it's being used to offset on the plus side where the big building is. And I do appreciate that the major component of this project is the big building. It's an economic necessity, I would assume, in the perspective of the developer, to have this number of units to make this an economically feasible project. I realize that the scale is out of character for the neighborhood, but it, as I said, is an economic necessity for this project to be economically feasible for the developer. I think I still have concerns about stormwater drainage, and I think that'll be further explored as we get closer to the end of this proceeding. But I think the concerns about traffic have been addressed by our peer reviewer, and I understand that 192 units, is it now? 184. Justify some skepticism about how the traffic will work, but we have a professional study that seems to have substantiated the fact that it's not going to have a major impact. Side streets, I sympathize with the people that are abutters to this project, but I do think that we've at least heard arguments on both sides of it, and it's been addressed. So overall, my feeling is that there has been a great deal of progress toward a more acceptable project. I think design review will have a lot to do with the visual impact.
There is no design review. There is no design review.
Well, I think we're still having input on design. So I look forward to working out the solutions that Chris may have some input in. And, my overall perspective is that we've seen progress, and I'm looking forward to getting this done with the understanding that 40B allows this kind of development, whether the neighborhood really likes it or not, or whether we really like it or not. So what we're trying to do is direct it in a way that's most acceptable, that the developer can live with and that we can accept. So I'm looking forward to moving forward on that.
Right. Thank you. I'd like to now. Can I finish? Thank you. I'd like to invite the public now to offer its testimony. And what I'd like to ask is that with respect to the public's testimony, that you focus on things that you've heard this evening. That is the modifications and obviously the discussion. And I think that what we'll do is, as we've done before, just by show of hands, again, how many people plan to speak? Okay. So we'll do what we've done before, which is if people will line up on the side and then approach and give us your names, and although we should know them by now. So shame on us.
I have only 2 comments. I'll be brief. My name is Steve Cumenti, 262 Russet Road, a town meeting member, precinct 16. This second project is really the third project. You didn't see, formally submitted was not the first project, but in effect, this new project with the 10 or 9 buildings and the 5 really 7-story building was actually the very first project that was submitted to Mass Development. Essentially, Mass Development found that first project, the conceptual site plan was not appropriate for the site due to elimination of the green belt buffer and the massing of the 5-story building. They were going to reject the project. And their lawyer in court said that, well, they would approve any project that wasn't ridiculous. Meaning this project that you are now considering, which is this project, they've gone back to that first project, is ridiculous and would have been rejected by Mass Development. The project they actually first submitted to you was in fact the 12 buildings and the 4-story. Basically, Mass Development asked them to lower the size of the building, which they did. They asked them to include a bunch of 4-bedroom apartments, which they did. And they basically got a free pass to come to see what they could sell to you. What you're comparing this third project to as an improvement is this second project that Mass Development basically gave them a free pass on. This project you're considering now is the first project that Mass Development found to be basically, in effect, ridiculous and was going to reject. We've submitted this letter to you and materials we've given to you. This is not, 40B is not a free pass. Basically, they get away from selective zoning to prevent affordable housing, but they're still supposed to meet the legislative standards that the project is appropriate considering the conceptual site plan, building massing, topography, environmental resources, and integration into the existing development patterns. If they don't do that, you don't have to approve anything. Mass Development wasn't going to approve this first project. Basically then, and the only second thing is I appreciate that you have some impression about what you think you are compelled to do and what you are required. When you do make a decision, obviously if you think something's a great idea, by all means. But if you think you're making a decision because you are compelled or constrained to do something, I hope you will put that in your decision, because it makes it a lot different how we go to a judge and explain, not that we disagree that something's a great idea that you thought was a great idea, but merely that we disagree that you were compelled or constrained to approve something ridiculous. So just to be specific about what it is you feel you have to do as opposed to what you want to do when you make your final decision. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Nancy Daly, a member of the Board of Selectmen. And I heard a number of you say that the developer says that this is what they need to make this project financially viable. And I do understand that legally, if you impose conditions that make the project financially unfeasible, that would not withstand court scrutiny. But my question is, what are you simply going by their word on what is financially viable, or has there been any review done of the pro formas and everything to look at this and see independently what people think is financially viable?
Answer the uneconomic.
Well, I think the way the process works, you're correct, but there's a process as well where if in fact the zoning board believes that they can't live with X number of units or whatever aspect of the program they can't live with, then it's within their purview to go to the applicant and say, we can't live with this. And then the applicant's response might be well, either we can make the change or we can't because it's economically infeasible, at which point the board would be within its right, according to the regulations, to request that the applicant provide its pro forma, and the board would have a peer review done of that pro forma to determine whether the particular condition or conditions rendered the project
Okay.
uneconomic.
Well, I continue to believe that the 5-story building is too big, and, I think you should challenge that assumption that they must have that many units. Secondly, on the parking, several of you mentioned, well, this is South Brookline, so it's different. But they're putting in a kind of density that's much more like North Brookline. So asking them to consider transportation demand management or getting people to public transportation or whatever so you could reduce the number of parking spaces, I think would be quite reasonable. And I know that one of the great concerns I have heard from many of the neighbors is the sheer number of cars that are going to be going on to what are, I actually drove down Beverly in the morning when people were trying to get their kids to school, and it is very crowded, lots of cars, lots of kids, and this is going to be a huge number of cars going out on those roads. And so efforts to reduce the number of parking spaces will reduce the number of cars and have, I think, a salutary effect on the neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Scott Gladstone, Precinct 16, town meeting member, 383 Russet Road. So I don't want to repeat anything Nancy said. I thought everything she said and what Steve said were excellent. I do want to follow up a little bit, though, on her point about the pro formas. As I understand the answer, that this can only go in one direction. So in other words, you don't have the ability to say, what are your pro formas now, so that you can then look at that and say, okay, you're making this much profit in this many units, therefore let's ask them to take out this many units so that we get them just to the edge of profitability. So if my understanding is that they cannot do it that way, I see you're nodding, that's correct, they can't do it that way, then the only way to do this in a sensible way without buying a pig in a poke, which is what we're currently talking about, because you're just, actually you're not even taking their word for it because they haven't said how profitable this proposal is. I mean, this could be over the moon profitable. There could be a huge margin in there. So apparently the only way to test that is to say, well, we are considering a condition that's going to considerably lower the number of units. And you would do it in a way that addresses the concerns you have. So for instance, Mr. Hussey wanted to see much more step back. Wanted to see and everybody wanted to see that large building being much smaller. Ask them, rather than, I heard what they were saying, that you can't make 3 stories nearer to Russet Road and then put those units you're losing there further down the building, because then that would then cause steel construction, which is more expensive. I then understand how that may work into a pro forma. But what if they were required to do 2.5 or 3 stories closer to Russet Road and then only have 4 stories further down, and then they have to lose units? Well, at that point, we're in a position where they have to show the pro formas, and we can actually do this exercise and not buy a pig in a poke. Similarly, the freestanding units that are not in the large units, many of them include these lofts. Well, the lofts, we've said over and over again, are going to be more bedrooms. It's going to be much more density than they're representing that there will be in those units. That may be why they're talking about 3 cars per unit, although I'm going to address that in a second. But there again, if you would rather see a transition from the 2.5-story existing neighborhood to the more dense units, then require them to do 2.5 stories in smaller house-like units in the standalone units. And again, they would have to lose some square footage and maybe a unit or bedroom. And again, there you'd be in that position where they would have to show the performance. And you could do that analysis, which right now, not intentionally, but I hopefully as you're punting on, but hopefully as a consequence of this discussion, you'll see the benefit of doing that. Also, another possibility is to remove, so as Mr. Hussey was saying, one way to remove some of the infill from between the corners is to stack. Well, the other way, of course, is to eliminate some of the infill. And again, we're in that pro forma situation. I think that all these things should be requested. Smaller building, less infill, smaller freestanding buildings. And then we get to that pro forma question. Now, the parking. Before we get to that. Also, the other thing that may drive, when you do get to that pro forma and you do see what the numbers are and you do see where they say economic ability is, and then we have a peer review to say whether or not it's uneconomic or it's economical, we may get to a point where the margins get a little thinner and it may get a little bit dicier for the developer. At that point, maybe then they will be willing to sit down with us and talk about putting a lot of this density elsewhere on the site where it would require some give and take about town meeting action or other things because they may be impacting the 40A site. Right now, they have no incentive to do that. And that's why we are stuck in this, as I've heard a couple of you say before, them putting the buildings in the worst possible place on the entire development. So I would like to see us get to that point.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Are you saying that somebody sitting on the ZBA said that?
Somebody on the ZBA has said that the placement of the buildings on the edge of the property, as opposed to more where there's other green areas closer to the Boston line, is the worst possible placement for the buildings. And it's a shame that other sightings could not be entertained because of that impact on the 40A. I have definitely heard that. I believe Chris said that. And Mr. Hussey can correct me if I'm wrong.
I don't recall it. I can go back to the transcript. So
Okay.
you can go back.
All right. I definitely. All right. Did anybody not say that this is the worst possible place to put the housing? We wish that there were other available spots on the existing Hancock Village development.
I think we haven't said.
Okay. I must be delusional, but all right. Parking. The reason that they are insisting, this is based on statements they made during the earlier process, that they have to have the number of parking spaces according to zoning, which is something they could ask for a waiver for this, just like they're asking for a dozen other waivers, is because it's not because they want 3 or 4 parking spaces per unit. It's because they want the parking for the existing structures on the 48 lot. I'll tell you a quick story. Before my parking lot at 1244 Boylston Street, which is in Chestnut Hill, but Brookline, went to valet, it was catch as catch can, and sometimes you didn't get a spot. Now they have tandem parking because they have the valet. The Charles Schwab building got 4 spots that were saved for them. But they put in the furthest possible part of the parking lot, the furthest away from the Charles Schwab building. So the Charles Schwab people they came in early because they're brokers, and they parked in the closest spots. So that then left vacant their reserved spots, which none of us could use from the law firms and the doctor's offices because they were reserved for them. But they were also allowed to grab the closer spots. Well, that's what's going to happen here. The people in the large building, if they don't get a spot in the garage or in the parking lot nearby, they're going to park in the other existing Hancock Village spots. Well, then those people are going to be pushed somewhere else as well. On the other side, I believe that's on the west side, those parking spaces are going to be used exactly for the purpose that they are actually intending, although not saying, which is they're going to be used for the existing residents in the 40A lot. That's why they want to have so many spots there. But that's the biggest thing taking away the green space, is that much hardscape. If all they had was access roads, they could do much, much more with the green space. But because they have to have the space for all the parking, that's what's taking up so much of that green space. The idea that they're borrowing spots from the west side in order to service the east side is just a fiction. They don't need that many spots. The spots that they currently have are underutilized. We've shown pictures of that. And as Nancy said, there are so many ways they could make this a much more transit-rich area, which the whole neighborhood is clamoring for anyway. They do have a Longwood Medical Area van. They should be stepping that up, and they should be doing it on the weekends as well. There's a lot of things that they could be doing to alleviate the need for parking and to take advantage of the town's trend to reduce the number of parking spots required. This board gives waivers for parking all the time. You're able to waive up to 50% under many conditions, and usually that's the request. And it's because people, they don't need as much parking, and it's onerous for them, and it makes development more difficult. Here we have sort of the old school, well, no, we want to build as much parking as possible. That is not the trend now for a reason. And we're losing a lot because of it, and it's not necessary, and it's the kind of thing that, again, you could ask, you should have fewer spots. We'll give you a waiver for the number of spots meeting zoning, and if they say somehow that challenges their economic ability, then they can show you the pro formas. And again, we had that discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Florence Coslow. I live on Russet Road. I've lived there for about 60 years or more, and I'm hoping that you will listen to the abutters, who I feel have some rights as well as developers, who I have heard with my own ears said, we can do anything we want, we own the land. I would like you to listen to us, who will have to deal with a negative impact on living on Russet Road. I did go on that walking tour, and we were astonished when we saw how big this building was going to be. We also realized that there were many other units already existing to use Asheville to exit and enter. And we know from the neighbors who live around Asheville that that's been a major concern. So now we're talking about, I heard 100, close to 200 new parking spaces, which means that could be 200 odd people, plus delivery men, plus visitors, plus the Chestnut Hill trucks that ride up and down Russet Road. So I didn't hear in the discussion how this new proposal was going to make the egress onto Russet Road any better. I have a feeling if you said to the new tenants, oh, try not to use Russet Road because they can't egress on the VFW Parkway, I don't know how many would try to be good about it and not use it. I think that's kind of wishful thinking. My other question is the blasting that's going to occur. And I'm wondering, in their original plan, if the engineers had estimated the duration of the blasting. Is this weeks? Is this months? What is it going to involve? Can we stay in our homes when they're blasting? And how does this new proposal, did it lessen? And if so, how much did it lessen what we can expect to tolerate? Will we be compensated if our walls begin to crack and any damage to glass is done? I don't know if anybody's considered this. I would like to offer it up as other considerations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anthony Abner, 265 Russet Road. Three very quick comments. The first is that I did ask at the last meeting a question, which is that in the June 5th meeting, Mr. Levin said that negotiations had been going on with the town of Brookline, which asked to increase the density in the apartment building. I still would like to know who was representing Brookline in those discussions. The second thing is that we're now almost a year into the process, and if I heard Mr. Geller correctly tonight, we still don't know how tall the apartment building is going to be when you add on the utility or the air handler on the top. By Brookline zoning laws, the height of the building is measured from the street to the maximum height of the building. So that really matters as far as what the height of the building is. As far as I can see, it's now going to be close to 100 feet above street level, but we don't know. And I think at this point, we really should know some of these facts. And the third thing is the comment that Mr. Levin made tonight. These are going to be luxury apartment buildings with people who will own 2 or more cars. I think everybody here recognizes that the affordable housing issue is a smokescreen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, William Barrow, 45 Asheville Road. I just wanted to point out, again, the economical feasible. I mean, is the argument that if they were only to build those 4 units on the west side, that the whole project would not be feasible at all? I mean, if you put any bed in Brookline near Baker School, you're going to make money on it. So, again, I'd just like some more criteria. How is that based? How is that calculated? You know, if you did everything but that apartment building, there's definitely profit there. There's no way there's not profit there. So why does apartment building have to be included? The second thing, you know, when we finally do get around to talking about drainage, there are real guidelines. I think I'll be able to poke holes through that drainage report, that study, and kill the project on drainage alone. But outside of the drainage, there doesn't seem to be any kind of guidelines. And I was just wondering, are there guidelines when you look at traffic, when you look at building height? Is there anything that I can use as an engineer to prove that it doesn't meet these standards? Or is the standard look and share your opinion? And I'm just wondering that out of my own thing. And then I just want to ask again, you made a great point. You did a good job of trying to answer our questions this evening, but that was a question that I remember being asked. Who was the person that directed Hancock Village to mass all the units right outside my door? I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I live right there at 45, and I'll be staring at this 5-story building, 7-story building every single day. Why isn't the building go from VFW Parkway all the way to the Baker School, and it's 2 stories tall? Then everyone shares in this. Why was the decision made to lump this horrible mess right in front of my house? Was it, you know, I'm taking the heat for all my neighbors who are getting off easy? You just decided Will Varel is the guy that's going to take all the crap from this? So, and then I just want to go on a little more. I learned from a coworker that whose daughter worked at the Bournewood Hospital that it's for sale. And I was just wondering, you said that, you know, the traffic study is complete. If Bournewood's, you know, these guys look at this, and I can already see them, they're like, really? Land? You know, if they decide to put a 10-story building over there, 1,000 units, how will that affect Asheville Road? So I don't think the traffic study is complete. I think that has to be considered. This project alone increased traffic, as their own report said, by 600%, even though they estimated the average traffic growth was 2% per year. It was like 600% new cars on Asheville Road. If Bournewood is developed, what is that going to do for the neighborhood? You know, who knows how many units they could stick in there when the hospital's torn down. Then my next question is, you guys talked about, well, could they put more units in this 40B development? Why would they do that? They could just start tearing down these stupid 2-floor units and putting up 5-story units all the way across. This building could spread like Ebola across that whole lot, and before you know it, that could be a community of 6-story buildings. You're setting the precedent right here that it's acceptable, it's reasonable, as long as some of them are 40B. What is going to stop that entire area that's highlighted right there from being 5-story units everywhere?
Mr. Chairman, I think that reference is totally inappropriate.
To Ebola?
Yes.
Oh, I'll change it.
Totally inappropriate. It approaches a slander, and I really think it's...
I'll withdraw Ebola. It depends, and I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Okay, and then just a couple other things that were said, and again, we'll discuss this in the drainage, but they talked about the grading of the site and how they had to, change some areas, but some they could not because of the drainage concerns. And at one point, they made a comment about, well, because of the ledge, we're actually blasting ledge to make some of these grades work. If you're blasting ledge, where's the water going? Water does not go into ledge. It hits ledge and it runs off the property. If they're blasting ledge, that means they're at the bottom, and this is rock, and it's not going anywhere. So I just hope that, this stormwater report addresses that. And then the other thing I'd like to point out is, I look at this map, and I can see just from walking through there every single day that there's ledge outcroppings all out throughout this site. And I just hope that when they show a tree, that you can actually plant a tree there, because everyone knows you can't plant a tree on a rock. So I think if they map the ledge and showed it clearly and just made certain that they're not planting trees on rocks, that would make it helpful so that when they go out there, they can't say, well, there's a rock here, I can't plant a tree. Sorry, the plan was not accurate. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Bill Pooh. I'm in a butter at 249 Beverly Road, and I'm a town meeting member. I just have three little points and then one bigger point. One is I really like the point you made about the restrictions. I don't think, clearly nothing should be approved or nothing should go forward without a restriction on this property under discussion, the 40B property. But I would extend that also to the undeveloped property, because otherwise we're going to be back here in a few years on residences of South Brookline number 2 or 3. There's nothing to stop a development there, and I would not let anything go forward on this property unless you have that in exchange. Second quick point, I think Scott was right on about the parking. The issue is not really about people wanting to walk or not walk to parking. It's about that's just the Trojan horse to get more parking for the established units, which is not really an appropriate use of 40B. The third is about the traffic. I think it's all well and good to say you're going to try to get an entrance onto the VFW Parkway, but unless that's a condition, that's going to be a pipe dream. It's got to be a condition. Now, the big point that I'd like to make is I was very disturbed listening to what your deliberation was, because you guys are in a difficult position. You have limitations on what you can do, and you feel, anyway, I can't put myself in your shoes, but I guess what I'm hearing is that someone said the scale is out of character for the neighborhood. It's basically too big. You're trying to think of how to fit something that's too big onto something that's too small, but you can't do it. But you feel like you're bound to stick to what is being proposed in terms of scale. But I guess I want you to ask yourselves, why is that scale set in stone? Why can't you ask it to be half the scale? Why can't you ask it to be a third of the scale? At least if you put that down as a condition, we can come back and have a negotiation about what is really economically feasible. Right now, we have no idea, as Scott pointed out. There's only one thing for sure, is if you roll over and don't protect our interests, then something too big will be built. That's for sure. If you would stand up for your principles and think about what was right for Brookline, then there's a possibility that out of this, there will be a battle, there'll be some post-decision discussions, and out of those discussions, maybe something more appropriate will come out. But at the way you're going now, it's guaranteed that something too big will be built there. I just want to ask you to, to think about what would you approve on this site if it was not a 40B? That should be your guiding principle here. That is what would be appropriate for this site. You can't feel confined by 40B. If your decision is challenged later, so be it. But at least it'll be something that sets a limit as to what could be built. If you approve something bigger, then of course it's going to be built. If it's lower, then at least there can be a battle later to fight it. you to think of what's best for Brookline and to stand up for your principles, to think about what this project should be without 40B, and to try to aim for that as your target. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My name's Judy Leichner. I'm a town meeting member, Precinct 16. I'm not in a butter. And many of the points that I wrote down as I was listening to all of you have been made, but I just want to emphasize a couple of things. The idea, this is a 40B, we're talking about affordable housing, and yet I heard Mr. Levin say a number of times, luxury housing, luxury housing. I almost felt like I fell down the rabbit hole or something. The thought of multiple 40Bs, they have a whole lot of property there. And I think I heard you say, Mr. Hussey, that, you know, wouldn't it be nice if something big were built in the back of their property? And maybe I misunderstood you, but I certainly know that that's what the planning board had said originally, that they picked the most expensive part of their property, possibly to make the argument about what's economically feasible and what's not, because they have to do so much blasting there. And I understand they picked these two lots, but they picked these two lots. And so I think it's something to think about as we think about what needs to go there. Again, the idea of what's economically feasible, I don't think there's any reason for accepting that what they say is economically feasible. They had to make the trade-off. They took a few units out, so therefore now we need a 5-story building again. In Needham, in I believe it was February, the developer asked for 300 units. The ZBA gave them 109 and said, this is what you have to do. I would hope that the ZBA fights just as hard for Brookline to say, you don't need all of these units. They should be the ones who have to prove that they absolutely have to do it. And as a few people pointed out, anything they put in there is going to be economically feasible. They're going to make money on it. And I also was a bit disturbed when somebody, you know, when they were answering the design reviewer's question about why this building was so tall well, because it's a building. I mean, that is not an answer. But I think you can ask that question and make that question, and don't just accept because it's a building, because we have to have 184 units. There's nothing that says they have to have that, and they need to prove that they need that. And the other question, of course, the parking. They're asking for waivers, and the initial project for 19 waivers, and the fact that they didn't want one for parking, again, speaks to the fact that they want parking for their existing units. And the final question about what else can they build. We all know that when this was first sent out, it said the residences of South Brookline 1. Part 2 is going to come, and we'll all be back here again. Make a stand now. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time, and I know you're all working really hard. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody have a comment, question? Nope. Okay. As I've done in the past, I will offer to the applicant the opportunity to provide additional testimony, respond.
Well, I'd just like to make 2 points. One is in response to a comment that Mr. Book made about the VFW Parkway. I think you said that it would be beneficial to all of Hancock Village. And frankly, we agree. And it's common sense, and added access is always a good thing. And I can say that we would diligently pursue that ingress and egress, obviously with the town's support, because we would need that. I don't see how the project could be conditioned upon that, however, because it's out of our control. Second point I'd like to make is in terms of my comment about luxury apartments. There's, 20% of the units are going to be affordable. The other 80% of the units will be very high-end as a continuation of the theme of the actual program in its entirety, which is to offer a wider range of rental options to what is right now a very homogeneous all-townhouse development. So we're introducing flats across the board, and with the exception of the lofts, and these are going to be high-end. Steve would like to say.
Just to amplify on what Mark just said, as the board probably is aware, the affordable units are going to be comparable in size and appearance to the market rate units. So that's actually a benefit. The fact that, you know, these are frankly first-class luxury units, that will be true across the board. So I think it's actually of a benefit to the project. I want to address a couple other points that were made. One is as to economic feasibility and how the 40B process should work, and this is something which I'm sure you don't have to take my word for it. You have very capable attorneys and consultants that can advise you on this as well, and obviously the board has experience with 40B itself. But the notion that that some of the neighbors put forth, I think, has turned 40B on its head a little bit, meaning you know, we're proposing now 184 units. Tell them they can have 100 units. Tell them they can take all the buildings out of the S7. Tell them that instead of having a 5-story building, they can have a 2-story building. And then let them prove that they can't make that project work. That's not the way 40B is supposed to work. The way 40B works, and there was a comment from one of the neighbors, Mr. Pooh, I think, said, you know, just don't treat this as though we're a 40A project. Don't be constrained by 40B. That's not the way it's supposed to work either. The way it's supposed to work is we submit a plan. We discuss the merits of that plan as a plan. We try and come up with changes and modifications that make it a better plan, which through the help of the working group and the advice of board members through these hearings, we think we've done a very good job at doing that, and of course the process isn't complete. And at that point, you know, hopefully the board can see its way through to saying, you know, this is not what we would choose if this were a 40A, but under the construct of 40B, this is an acceptable plan that the town can live with, looking at the interest of the town as a whole, and not just the immediate abutters. Of course, the abutters are an important interest group, but 40B looks at the interests of the town as a whole. And hopefully we're going to get there, and not this idea that you should just, you know, slash the density of this project and then have a developer prove that that renders a project uneconomic. I would respectfully suggest to you that that's really not the way this process is supposed to work. And I think we've done a really good job in working in good faith, and the town has done a good job working in good faith, trying to improve this plan and come up with a better plan that everybody can live with. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank everyone for their testimony tonight. That includes the applicant, the public, and I want to thank the ZBA members for their information. The next hearing will be on September the 8th, starting at 7 p.m. We will continue this hearing until then. Thank you very much.